Welcome back. My name is Mike, and we are back out in the shop. We're going to discuss some suspension topics in this segment of our Summer Camp 2021 video series. And what we're going to do here is kind of talk about what these things are in front of me, what they do, why you might consider changing out certain parts of your suspension, and as a more in-depth guide to what things do specifically in relation to your car. So if you have any questions along the way, I'll try to get to as much as I can. We are relatively limited in how much time we have today, but if you got more questions than what I'm able to answer while I'm on camera, put them down below. We'll be sure to comment back, reply to your questions, and answer them there. If I have enough time at the end, towards the end of the video, we'll try to catch some of those questions then too. So, thanks again for joining. Let's go ahead and get stuck into it. Now, there's a bunch of stuff, some clean, some dirty. I will apologize in advance. Some of this stuff has been prototype stuff that we've had kicking around the shop, so you'll notice some of it maybe not quite as pristine as others, but just to kind of glaze over that and also to show you what your parts on your car probably look like at least a little bit. We've got some antique specimens here, shall we say. So, why might you want to change your suspension system? What would you be looking to achieve? Why do you want to change your suspension system? Is it just because you read online that, hey, coilovers are cool, or man, you should really get the big fat front sway bar for autocross, or man, your car is a 4x4, you better get that thing down low, right? I'm sure you've all heard those kinds of comments either from online or maybe even buddies at the local racetrack. So if you're looking to make a change, first let's address why. Why would you want to make a change? And you could say that I'm looking for aesthetics. I want the car to look like it's not a 4x4. That's legitimate. Or you might say that I really like the car, it handles well, it feels nice, but there's just so much body roll. I want to address that. I don't want the car to just lean really dramatically throughout the corners. Or you might say that when I drive really hard on the track, it's just not able to keep the tires on the pavement. And so you need to address these particulars so that way you can make the car handle the way you want it to. So there's several different ways that you can actually go about doing that. And we're going to start off by what most people think of when they change the suspension, and that's shocks and springs or coilovers. So if you were watching the earlier video where Jeremy was kind of covering the upgrade path, he talked about how coilovers are kind of a generic term that a lot of people use when they're talking about doing some kind of a setup such as this. This is one of our Fox coilovers. And technically speaking, all Miata shocks and springs are coilovers because the coil is over the shock. Simple, right? Makes sense? But in a coilover that most people think of when they think coilovers, they're thinking something that has a threaded body. And the spring perch right here can move up and down, slide by threading it up or threading it down to change that spring perch position so that way you can lift the spring up or you can raise it down. So most people have heard that term. Coilovers could come as something like this. It could come in something like this is a stock shock off of an ND Miata, but same kind of configuration. You've got a shock. I don't actually have the factory spring over here. I apologize. We'll just use this one. This is one of our springs. As an example, sorry if that was loud, headphone users. But you'll have the spring over the shock, and this one, it just doesn't have a threaded body, so you can't move that perch up and down. So same kind of setup. It fits in the car pretty much the same basic way. Now, if you're looking for more low, because that's what you're after, then generally speaking, you'll probably pick something like a coilover that has that adjusted shock body, or adjustable spring perch, rather, so that way you can set your ride height. By moving the springs up or down, you can change the ride height of the vehicle. And by doing so, you can also, for the more track-oriented or interested in being more track-oriented drivers, you can use that technique to be able to corner weight your car. So if you needed to be able to change the balance of the car for each corner, you can actually use that by moving or tilting, shifting the car at each corner to help shift the weight around a little bit better, so that way the car's balance is more equal from left to right, front to rear, as much as you can anyway. So that's another benefit of using a more coilover style setup. Now, for a shock that is more traditional like this, that doesn't have an adjustable perch, you can still get some really good adjustment out of it. We have a set that's actually utilizing the Koni Sports that will match it with some of our springs, that it will still lower the car a little bit compared to stock. So if you're wanting that aesthetic change, or if you're just wanting to make the car handle better, if that's really the goal, you want to just make a change where you're influencing the ride characteristics but not necessarily wanting to get into the nitty-gritty, you might be more interested in a setup that's a well-valved shock with a good matched spring. And if you're looking at our suspension kits like at the Konis I was talking about, the important thing is that you're getting a setup that has a well-matched shock and spring combo. So if you just throw together any old shock, it could be a really high-quality shock from X name brand that has, lots of good reviews. But if you get a spring that's not really well mated to that valving of that shock, even if that spring was a $150 spring, whatever, that might still not be a good combination. The magic is when you have a spring and a shock that have been well matched. And so if you're looking to get a good combination, if you're not really into doing the test and tune yourself, or if you're not really knowledgeable about it and you just want to get a setup that is proven to be good, get something where the shocks and the springs have been tested together, they have been vetted, they have been developed together, preferably, so that way you can get a suspension that may be a better performing ride, but also a better ride overall because more time and care and development has gone into it to make it a good match for the vehicle. So more money doesn't always mean more good. That's one of the things you have to watch out for. I won't get off too far into the weeds on this one at this point, basically just to talk about there's so many choices out there, but the important thing when you're remembering when shopping for shocks and springs, or why you might want to change out your shocks and springs, the most important thing is to get something that is a good match. The springs and the shocks have been tested, they have been vetted, something that has been put together specifically for your car, so that way you know that you've got a good combo. So we've talked a little bit more about that. There's a few other components here that we'll kind of cover just in relationship to the shocks and springs. Just to cover some of the individual components, you've probably seen, most of you are probably most aware of bump stops, or have at least heard of bump stops. And what these guys do, they are a bushing, and they will sit on top of the shock. You can see this one has the same kind of bump stop on it. This guy has a bump stop right here. This Fox has a bump stop on it as well. And a bump stop's job is that when the spring is fully compressed and your ride, your wheels are shoved up into the fender liner, that when you run out of travel, that your springs are basically almost just barely to the point of touching, this bump stop should start making contact between the top and the bottom. And that prevents it from just being metal on metal hard crashing. So one, it's going to prevent you from just munching your suspension components. And two, it's going to provide a much nicer and much more comfortable transition from normal suspension travel to, oh, I've run out, but I've got a bump stop to save me. It's still going to be a bit harsh, much harsher than normal suspension travel when your springs are doing the work. But this is kind of a last measure when your suspension runs out of compression travel, when your suspension is fully shoved up into the fender liner. So that's what a bump stop's job is just to prevent you from hitting metal on metal when that shock is fully compressed. Now, there are other bushings on a shock. You can see on this one, this is for an NA or NB Miata. It has a bushing down here at the bottom. And that may not always be the case, but on NAs and NBs, due to the design, this will fit down into your lower control arm, and then there's a bolt that runs through it, and that's how this attaches. Some shocks like these NC and ND style shocks, the lower point actually has a C, or kind of a claw, that goes around a bushing that's on the upright itself. So generally speaking, you will have some kind of a bushing at the bottom. That way this has somewhere to be able to rotate, whether it's on the shock or on the upright, doesn't really matter, just depends on your car. But that is something, another bushing that's part of this assembly. that you do need to keep an eye on. Bushings are generally either polyurethane or some kind of multicellular urethanes, or rubber, typically speaking. And they will wear out over time. So another thing to keep an eye on if you're considering changing out suspension is check your bushings. On the subject of bushings, most upper mounts, so this is going to be for an NB specifically, or could be used in an NA depending on your setup. You'll have this mount, and this mount actually bolts into the chassis, and you'll have nuts that hold it to the chassis here. But you can see that there's also bushings here on the top, and then there's also a bushing on the bottom. And there's also a washer on the top and the bottom of these bushings, so that way this assembly would go on the top of this shock shaft here. It actually fit right about here, and the nuts would squish these bushings just enough to keep them in place, so that way the shock shaft is held solidly in place, but it still has a little bit of wiggle room that it can rotate. It can kind of move as it needs to as the shock is being compressed or the car is going through its suspension movements. These are also one of those things that it's easy to forget about because, I mean, they're little rubber bushings that are not very exciting, but more often than not, if you're replacing your suspension components, your shocks and springs, you should plan on getting new bushings at the same time. They are rubber. They will degrade and wear out even if your car has very few miles on it, especially NAs and NBs. Just because of the age, rubber does wear out. It does weather. It will probably be cracked. If you're curious to see what yours look like, as long as your car's on the ground, you can take that nut off the shock shaft and peel off this rubber bushing on top just to see what it looks like. And if it's not really pliable, if it's really smushed looking, this one's okay actually. But if it's something that has cracks in it, or it's really hard, or it's not pliable, then you probably need new bushings. They're also pretty cheap, so it's pretty safe to say that for the extra 25, 30 bucks, just get new rubber bushings if you don't want to mess with it and you want to make sure you're starting with new parts for your shocks and springs when you throw them in. So the NCs, I've also got an example here. NCs and NDs, the mounts will look a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same kind of orientation where they're going to have a bushing on top with a washer and then another one on the bottom. I don't have the bottom one here, but they look very similar, just slightly different style. The NA mounts are even more different. They're kind of the oddball out. They don't have separate components like this, and I wish I had one here handy, so I apologize that I don't. If you want to see what it looks like, there's actually a pretty good picture on our website of the NA replacement upper mounts that we have, showing a good new stock one versus an old stock one that's been worn out. And basically there'll be a gap at the top because it's a one-piece mount. All the rubber is vulcanized to two pieces of metal, and that rubber will start to degrade and wear out and compress over time. So we'll put a link down to that below as well, so that way you can see what it looks like. So we've talked about all of the shocks and springs a little bit here. Let's move on to the next component. And we're going to move over to let's start with sway bars as the next one. That's the second big component that most people want to change whenever they are wanting to do a suspension upgrade. So for sway bars, I've got two examples of a stock sway bar and then some aftermarket sway bars. These ones happen to be ours, of course. You can see that with the stock sway bars, they're pretty thin in comparison. They do an okay job for what Mazda intended from the factory, but if you've got a lot of body roll, it's because your stock sway bars are relatively thin, and the weight of the car can bend these a lot more easily than they can a stiffer sway bar. So as an upgrade, if you're looking to do something where you can make that car corner flatter, it feels more like the car's on rails. You've probably heard that term before. Or if you want to change the handling bias for oversteer or understeer, you might want to consider changing out your sway bars. And if you call in and ask this, that, I've got a few $100s that I want to make a fun change to the car, how it handles, how it feels, and you ask me what's the one thing that you'd recommend doing first, sway bars. It is probably the best bang for your buck that you can do on a Miata if you're looking to change something relatively simple and easy that doesn't change the handling or the ride quality of the vehicle, but really gives it a performance boost for its handling capabilities. So sway bars, they're very simple. They bolt on to the chassis here. These are the stock brackets. And then for these guys, they just have rubber bushings. And then these ends will attach to the control arms via these end links. So that way it can twist up or down on the left side or right side to help resist twisting motion. And simply, you unbolt these from the car. And then these ones bolt in its place. They may come with new brackets as well as polyurethane bushings if you're getting some of ours. This helps to keep the bar located, prevents it from doing as much squishy wiggliness as the rubber stuff does. But the other upgrade is that you can have multiple mounting holes for your end links. So you can take your end links and mount it in any one of these holes on adjustable bars like ours, and you can use that as a technique to be able to increase or decrease the amount of tension required or resistance that they provide, resisting that flex left or right. And why would you want to do that, you say? Well, if you have ever driven a car, usually front-wheel drive cars are pretty bad about this, that you go into a corner, you hit the brakes, and you start to turn the wheel so that way you can go around the corner, but turning the wheel doesn't seem to do anything, and the car just plows through. And you're like, but my wheel is turned like, 3 turns, what the heck? Well, either you lost a lot of grip, but assuming that you had good tires, that could be that you just have a lot of understeer that you need to take care of. And so you can use the different adjustments or different mounting holes on the sway bars to make that bar tougher to twist, or it resists twist more. Or if you move them out towards the outer holes, that'll give it more leverage, so that way it makes it easier to twist. And by doing that to the front or the rear, you can change that balance, so that way you can prevent understeer. Or if you want to go to the farther side, some guys actually really like it, where you can actually set it up to where the car wants to oversteer. And what that is, that if you've ever been out in the snow and you just floor it and then the tail end starts coming out, it feels kind of like that, where you're coming around a corner and then you start accelerating around the corner and the tail end starts to wag out. Assuming that you don't have issues with traction necessarily, if you've got decent tires, that may be an oversteer situation because of the handling bias that you have set up. So if you take a stiffer front setting than your rear, you'll have more understeer, generally speaking. Or if you have a stiffer rear setting than you do the front, then you'll have more oversteer. So this is one that we get a lot of questions about, and it's a little bit convoluted, or it can be hard to understand. I won't beat a dead horse on this one, but if you've got more questions about it, let us know. But if you're looking basically to change the handling bias for oversteer, understeer, or if you want to aim for something kind of neutral, which is what most people prefer, sway bars are a really easy way to do that. They're very handy. They make the car feel a lot flatter and more comfortable in the corners. It inspires a lot of confidence. Again, best bang for your buck upgrade you can do to pretty much any of the Miatas. Do we have questions? We have 2. Let's stop and answer a couple questions real quick.
Okay, the first question we have here is, and you kind of covered this, but maybe to just say it specifically, what would you recommend just to improve street driving?
So if you couldn't hear Jeremy, the question was, what would you want to do to improve street driving specifically in recommendation or in regards to suspension components? I kind of did answer it a little bit, or at least my opinion would be that start with sway bars. Really, that's the thing to do. This is really a decision-making process that you need to be honest with yourself and tell us what it is that you're looking to do. Are you looking to do something where the car is spending most of the time on the street and you're not going to be doing a lot of track day, but you still want this car to be fun? Probably doing sway bars and maybe doing a shock and spring upgrade would be a good approach. Or is this a track car, something that you want to be more competitive on the track? Well, at that point, you may be looking to do something a bit more extreme, where you're looking at doing much heavier duty coils, probably something that's going to have much higher valving capabilities on the shock. You may need to do some stuff that's a bit more extreme. You may even need to get into some of the suspension component bracing to prevent other components from stretching or twisting or warping otherwise, because you're really pushing the car hard and that chassis is going to want to flex. So it's a complicated answer, but really the question can be probably answered with, let us know what your goals are, and then we can help you choose the right direction for your particular car. We got... Oh.
For 2 seconds? In your opinion, what would your choice of suspension be for a street car? Just to
Oh, okay. So to give a specific one, if I had to choose a particular for a street car, I guess that's a good example. Thank you, Travis. My favorite combo for any of the 4 generations of Miata to do a street, like a fun street car, but not something that you're really going to do much competition with, maybe a weekend autocross or something like that, I would actually choose one of our Koni suspension kits paired with sway bars. I'm a big fan of the Konis. I think that they work really well. Yeah, actually several of our cars have the Konis on at the moment. The Koni Sports, that's the yellow shocks. They have adjustable damping. We do recommend the settings, or we have the recommendations in our installation settings. So that way you can get a Koni shock with our springs, with new bump stops. And then if you get the Stage 2 package, you can get it with our sway bars. And that will be an excellent setup for the street. It'll lower it just a little bit, but nothing, slammed. It won't be difficult to get in and out of for most people. It's relatively moderate. So it's kind of the best of all worlds. I tend to think of it as kind of an OEM plus kind of suspension kit. It's something that is still very comfortable to ride in on the street. I've driven thousands of miles with Koni kits over the years, and they're absolutely fine. They, in my opinion, they ride better than most stock suspensions because those shocks offer way more control than factory shocks, even the sports with the Bilstein shocks from the factory. So that would definitely be my pick. I really like the Konis with our sway bars. It's a great option if you're not looking to break the bank, if you're looking for comfort but still want a good bump and improvement. That's probably my recommendation for 90% of people that are looking for something along those lines. So thank you. Good question. I think there's another one. What do we got?
There's a few questions rolling in. Here's one more about sway bars before we get to a different topic. And to paraphrase, does a stiffer sway bar defeat the benefit of an independent suspension? Good
question. So just to repeat it, does a sway bar, or can a sway bar that is much stiffer, can it either defeat the purpose of having a stiffer shock and spring package, or could you possibly use a stiffer sway bar in exchange for softer springs, or stiffer springs in exchange for a stiffer sway bar? It's all interchangeable. So you can change the handling bias, that oversteer versus understeer, by going with stiffer springs or softer springs the same way that you can with stiffer sway bars or softer sway bars. They're all springs, and they all affect the handling bias of the car, and it's all a bit of it's a recipe, really. You have to do a combination thereof. You can do things that, as long as you're going with known recipes for shocks and springs or known recipes for sway bar sets, you can get it to where doing one or the other won't negatively affect the other one, as long as you're getting parts that have been designed that way. But if you want to really get into testing and tuning and really dialing in your car so that way you can get that oversteer, understeer balance where you want it, you absolutely can use different springs or different sway bars. Either one will affect that balance. So it's all related. You certainly can do a setup where there actually are a few guys that I know of that they don't run any rear sway bar at all because they're running pretty stiff rear springs. And it's really down to the balance of your preference that you're looking for on your car and what you're using it for, of course. So good question. That's another one that gets off into the weeds a little bit if you want to get into specifics, but that's a good question. Thank you for that. I heard that we might have some more. Do we want to cover a few more? Okay.
Sure.
Yeah,
There's more questions
we got some more questions. Thanks, guys.
So here's one, and once again trying to paraphrase this so that it comes across clearly. Say if you're going from a track day setup to a street setup, does adjustable damping help to stiffen and soften the suspension, or is that really more dependent on spring rates?
That's another good question. So If you have a shock that has adjustable damping, the question was mostly about, can you use that damping to be able to turn it up, to stiffen the damping to make it more like a track setup versus when you turn the damping control down to soften that shock to make it more like a street setup. And you absolutely can, within reason. So a lot of shocks, such as our Fox, or the Coney Sports, or even some of our VMAXs, and plenty of other brands, of course, have an adjustment where you can change how much rebound and compression damping you have with the shock. So you can make it a stiffer or basically more difficult to compress the shock or allow the shock to extend again, or you can turn it down and make it easier for it to compress and extend. So using this as a tool, a tuning tool, obviously there's going to be an ideal adjustment for the damping to match the spring. Now, you can take it to the track and maybe turn it up a few clicks or a few rotations or whatever, depending on your shock, so that way you can make that shock react more stiff or firmly to resist that change in movement, because maybe that would be better if you've got a track that you need to allow your suspension to be more firm because it's very smooth. You can take advantage of that and you can turn it up a little bit. Or if you're going out on the street and there's a lot of potholes, a lot of bumps, whatever, you may want to turn it down a little bit to allow your suspension to move a little bit more freely, because the spring is still going to be controlled by the shock. That's why there's two pieces. It's not just a spring by itself or not just a shock by itself on your suspension system. So there is a little bit of a, basically there's a window that this will work. If you go too much stiff, it's going to ride like a pogo stick. If you turn it too much soft, then it's going to bounce and float around like an old Cadillac. So there's a window of opportunity, but yes, you certainly do have that ability with adjustable shocks to be able to do that to an extent. What do we got? What else?
Okay, so here's a question where a viewer was asking about, what would we recommend as a setup for his specific car? But I would like to rephrase that question. Because the useful part here for our entire audience would be, how do we experiment to dial in suspension when you have adjustable components?
So, good question. The short answer is it takes a lot of time. If you need to or want to be able to set up your suspension and you've got a lot of adjustments such as adjustable shocks, adjustable spring perches, adjustable height, adjustable sway bars, you can even get adjustable control arms. We haven't even gotten into bushings and control arms yet. You can really go wild with the amount of adjustments that are available to you. And realistically, if you have all of it going at the same time and you don't know what you're doing, you're going to spend a lot of time making adjustments to try to figure it out. So the recommendation here is that unless this is a car that you really want to just dive in head first from the beginning, which is okay to some extent, I would recommend choosing one, maybe two components to do at a time, so that way you can limit yourself on the number of variables that you change. That way you can keep everything else constant and only change one thing at a time, or maybe two things at a time, so that way you can feel the difference that change made. And then if you've got adjustable ride height or adjustable damping or whatever, then you can go drive the car for a little bit, make a few little changes to just one thing at a time, and see what the difference is. Feel what the difference is. And that is test and tune in a nutshell, as you're trying to change one variable at a time and hone it into where you want it, and then change another variable and get that to where you hone it in where you want it. So it can take a lot of time. A lot of the stuff that you do, if you're getting off into the custom realm, it will take some time to do it, is the short answer. If you want help, especially if it's something that is one of our products, we likely can give you a leg up on some of that testing if you're looking into some of our potentially adjustable components. So we can help out with some of that, but I recommend doing little stuff at a time. That way you can feel the difference and you'll know better how to make those changes to your car to make it an improvement rather than just making random changes. We got any more that we want to address directly? Yeah? All right. Well, good. Thanks for all the comments, everyone.
All right, here's one more. And this one, let's see. there's a few ways you could go after this, I guess. Given all the great qualities of the Coney setup, why isn't there a more typical adjustable ride height setup? So basically, why aren't the Coneys ride height adjustable?
So good question, and this is kind of a bit of a trick question for ride height adjustability on the Coney shocks. So a lot of the Coney shocks that you've probably seen will be more like this, that they'll have a fixed perch. Depending on when you bought your Coneys, or if you're looking at Coneys, there are actually some versions that have been out that have multiple grooves in the shock body, and this perch can be raised or lowered on them. Now, the unfortunate thing is that this doesn't seem to be something that Coney has any kind of particular style for, or they don't have this is what we're doing from here on out. It tends to change from time to time. So some of the Coney Sport shocks have it, and some of them don't. But basically, some Coney shocks you can do that with, that you can use that different groove to move the circlip that's underneath this perch, to move the perch up or down, to give you a limited amount of ride height adjustment. There are even kits out there that you can get from companies such as Ground Control that will change this perch, or basically have an adapter for this perch to change it to have a threaded body that goes on the top, and it'll kind of ride right here. So you'll again have a limited amount of spring travel or ride height adjustment that you can use. So there are some options, but other than that, really, if you want to get off into that world for needing or wanting those kinds of adjustments, I would probably at that point be talking to you more about either like our VMAX suspension or maybe our Fox suspension, depending on your needs. So we would love to be able to offer a shock or lots of shocks that had a ton of different options, but we tried to pick the best from a few different categories, because otherwise we can get off again into the weeds in a hurry. Good question, though. Do we want to do any more, or do we have time?
Do we have time for any more, Travis? Okay. Let's take one more.
Okay.
And then we can call
We'll
it.
get one more question.
So this one, I'm also going to kind of paraphrase this one a little bit. This viewer is asking about the benefits of not running a rear sway bar, because he's seen some racers do it. And I would kind of refocus that question in talking, maybe you can talk a little bit about how when you're running no sway bar with high spring rates versus a sway bar with quote-unquote regular spring rates, what you can expect in terms of fixed versus steady state response versus transitional response, because I think that might be kind of the crux of the question, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this one's going to get off into the weeds pretty much right away. I'll try to cover it briefly. This is one that really, if you want to get off on this one, maybe give us a call. That might be the best way. That way we could work with you on this one if you really are considering one versus the other for your particular need. The question, though, about why it might be better to run without a rear sway bar at all and have stiffer rear springs, as far as what handling that gives you or what the car's reaction will be, is a bit of a tough one. As far as sway bars are concerned,
You want me to jump in for a high level?
I can, yeah.
You got it.
Yeah. So, I mean, the big benefit for sway bars is that it connects your left and right side of your suspension. So when your right side, say, if your right side suspension gets a little bit of a berm and it wants to lift up on that, it's going to resist by twisting against the left-hand side. So it's tying the two sides together somewhat. Again, there's a lot of leverage here, so it's limited, or it's lesser to a lesser extent than what most springs have as far as the kind of action that they are doing individually. So by running stiffer rear springs rather than having a sway bar, or running a really skinny rear sway bar, that left to right interaction is going to be lessened. You're going to have more travel or more available, basically free moving parts left to right than you would if you had a stiffer sway bar. So that might be advantageous if you have a car that's going to be going out to do rally racing, or potentially like a track that has really big berms, something like that, where you need to have a lot of articulation So you might use more of your spring to be able to determine what your understeer, oversteer handling bias is rather than using a sway bar. A lot of times, especially if it's a tight course like an autocross, you might see it where somebody runs a really big fat front sway bar, but not much, if any, rear sway bar. And that might be because they are whipping around these cones and corners that are, relatively low speed, that there's not enough momentum to keep the car actually planted, and they'll lift that rear wheel. And you'll lose traction, and you may even lose power because now that wheel's just free spinning depending on what your differential's like. So in cases like that, they may choose to run no sway bar or a very skinny rear sway bar, so that way there's more articulation there for that suspension to keep that inside wheel on the ground. Maybe more edge case scenario for most people unless you're getting into that more competitive edge of certain motorsports, really. So hopefully that answered the question. I tried to use a real world example to make that sink in, but let us know if you need more help with that one. We'd be happy to kind of cover some more of the details. I apologize. We're probably going to skip over some of the other questions for now because I still need to cover the third component in the suspension, since we've talked about shocks and springs, talked about sway bars. And the next one that we're going to talk about is going to be bushings and control arms. And these are going to be something that a lot of people may not think about because they're not really sexy, they're not really pretty. As I was telling you earlier, some of the parts tend to get pretty cruddy, nasty. So, but they are very much a part of your suspension because they are moving components, and a lot of times, especially for the older cars, the NAs and NBs, your bushings are probably pretty well weathered, just like those bushings for the shocks that I was talking about earlier, and that will affect ride quality. It'll affect the different kinds of transitional periods in your suspension movement, and generally speaking, how the car handles. If it feels really old, floppy, and kind of vague, it may be because your bushings are really worn out. So to be able to address this, basically there's two paths that you may choose to fix that or to upgrade, even if you've got decent stock bushings. And the two options that most people are going to choose between are going to be rubber replacement bushings or polyurethane bushings. So bushings in and of themselves, you have to have something. And as a kind of a third topic that we won't even touch in this video, there are some people that will actually remove or cut these off and weld on like rose joints or Heim joints. And that's if you're an extreme racer. We won't go into that. Basically, if you're looking for something more of a street application or something that's more friendly as far as you want to retain as much of the stock suspension character as possible, I'd probably point you towards rubber bushings because that's what they came with from the factory. You'll have rubber bushings that are pressed into these control arms. And rubber bushings, one, they have rubber, so they are a little bit squishy, right? And then also, two, the metal sleeve that's on the inside is actually vulcanized to the rubber. So part of this bushing's job is that it will rotate, the rubber will actually twist and rotate around this sleeve and act as kind of a spring of sorts along with the rest of your suspension. So if you do a rubber replacement bushing, you're not going to change the characteristic or the quality of your control arm movement when they're compressing and extending or basically going up and down in suspension travel. A lot of people prefer to do polyurethane bushings. And the difference about polyurethane bushings is that the sleeve is not directly connected to the bushings, so it can rotate independently of the bushings. The other big benefit to to polyurethane bushings compared to rubber is that with rubber bushings you need a press, or you need to be able to really have a lot of force to press them into the eyelets or the ends of your control arms, whereas with most poly you'll use some of the included lube whenever you buy them, but they pretty much install by hand. Very simple. The difference though is that with the poly bushings, they are something that they don't have the same kind of quality as far as give. They're stiffer than the rubber bushings. So I can bend this one Actually, I'll show you on this side. I can bend and move this one very easily, but when you've got your metal sleeve in this bushing, it's not really going to compress or squeeze all that much, maybe just a touch. More of the motion of the polyurethane bushings is that they are more like a bearing, but they have more life to them. They will last a lot longer than like a rose joint or Heim joint or something like that, generally speaking, and they are still going to have some give to them. The one thing that you have to be aware of with poly bushings, though, is that because they do require grease on the street, you may notice if you drive your car a lot that they squeak. They may have run out of grease or squish all the grease out, and you have to re-grease them occasionally, depending on the brand that you get. Now, there are some brands such as the Super Pro bushings that we sell, and they actually have a very proprietary material that's very slick, very slippery, and also has a specific knurl on the inside that retains grease. And these kinds of poly bushings don't have to be re-greased ever, as long as you install them correctly and lube them correctly. So there are some pros and cons to each. I generally say stick with rubber for street use, and poly if you're doing something more track-oriented or more aggressive driving. They do feel a little bit different, but this is one of those things that it does take a lot of time. You have to remove all your suspension components to do it. Generally, when people are doing it, it's usually on a car that's being torn down over the winter or something like that. But these are another component that you should at least consider. Check them out. Look at your control arm bushings to see if they are getting bad. And if they are, you should plan on replacing them with something like this. And if you need help picking which one might be a good option for you, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to help you out to kind of guide you along the path that may suit you better one way or the other, depending on your use. So I think that we're getting towards the end of my time. I think that we'll wrap it up here. I've tried to give you a little bit of an overview of suspension components as a whole for your car. Now, these components are going to look different for the different generations, I know, and I apologize I didn't have an example for each different generation, but I'd need a much bigger table for that if we did. So if you have questions about these components, if you have questions about your particular car that you want to do XYZ with, feel free to reach out to us. We would love to help you pick a suspension kit, even if it ends up not being our parts. We want you to be happy with what you're getting, and a lot of us have plenty of experience setting up suspension components, setting up cars, and doing different installation processes that we can help you out and point you down a path that will make the car what your goal for it is eventually. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. I certainly appreciate your time. I appreciate your questions. For those of you that I wasn't able to answer, we will go ahead and answer your questions below in the comments. That way they're addressed. And of course, let us know if you have any other questions or need anything else. We'd be happy to help you out. Now that we've finished with our suspension video, the next one in line is going to be our mild to spicy comparison. So this is going to be a shot where we actually compare a few of our shop cars and show you more of a mild side of what a lot of like bolt-on upgrades might be to an upgraded Miata, but not getting too terribly crazy, all the way up to a completely relatively insane build where, you throw the pocketbook and, lots and lots of time at the car to make it into an absolute monster. So you'll get to see an example of several cars driving, our impressions of what they are on the road. That way you can help to decide, do I want to go all out bonkers crazy on this build, or do I want to do something a bit more sane, or somewhere in the middle? So join us for that starting at 2 o'clock Mountain Time, and hopefully you enjoy it. Let us know if you have any questions, and we'll see you on the other side.